welcome again to another program of Searching for Answers. May I suggest that you gather your different Bibles, different interpretations of the Bibles, dictionaries, and read along with us. We're in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 7. We're going to start chapter 7 now. On my right is
Richard Rice, Loma Linda University.
And John Jones, La Sierra University.
And Bernard Taylor, Associate Pastor, Loma Linda University Church.
Now, if you've found your Bibles, and we hope that you have, like I said, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And I'm going to ask Rick Rice to read that for us, please. This is supposed to be about marriage.
1 Corinthians 7 begins, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote," evidently up until now, Paul has been listing things that he heard. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, they're probably sighing with relief. Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. Finally, he's going to get around to answering our questions. "It is well for a man not to touch a woman. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind."
Yeah.
All right. Does somebody have a different version that's a little bit different from what...
I think that's the new...
I think we've got the new Revised Standard Version. That's the one I have.
And I think
Okay.
Bernard yours
We all
is
do.
right. So
Mine's New International Version.
we need to hear that
Yeah.
in the
Because I think it's a little bit...
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I will read from the beginning of chapter 7 of the book of 1 Corinthians. "Now for the matters you wrote about. It is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent, and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this is a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that as far as you went?
That's
Yes.
as far as I went.
Okay. You want to continue on, Bernard?
Or do we have anything to say about this paragraph?
We'll go ahead. If
I'm
you...
wondering if Paul he's in a sense, he's addressed in chapter 6 the people who
Yes.
may have had a very casual attitude towards sexual behavior and said, now, you got to understand it's much more serious than that, okay? So no casual sex. There's something serious going on. Now it seems he's addressing people who might have taken the other extreme and said, well, then we're all better off without any sexual activity at all. And here again, maybe this is something you mentioned earlier, John, in an earlier session, the quotation that he uses as a way of encapsulating their attitude. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. And he goes on to say, now, that's not what I'm saying, okay? There is an appropriate place for sexual activity, and then he goes on to talk about what that is.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a congregation which, on the one hand, is in chapter 5 boasting about this business, and in chapter 6 reveling in their kind of libertine position in life, and now to have this kind of attitude to address. What it looks like is that the church is indeed split, as Paul tells them they are later on. You are divided, yeah? They're divided over several things, but it's because of the split between body and soul. That old dualism is raising its head even within Christianity, and it's haunting them here. Once you get the idea, that was an important part of Platonic thought, in fact, that this world draws upon. Once you get the idea that the spirit part of you is that which is valued by God, valuable, holy, good, upright, pure, can rise above the world, and that the body, being physical, is limited, temporal, and has a propensity for doing all kinds of wrong. Once you get that notion of a split there, then you either, on the one hand, you're going to take one of two attitudes, it seems to me. On the one hand, well, then what I do with my body has nothing to do with my spiritual life at all. Therefore, I can indulge my body in whatever old way I want to, and it's no impact on my saved condition in Christ. Or, on the other hand, you're going to get the idea that because the body is carnal and therefore the root of evil in my life, I must put down the body all the time in every way I can, gain the victory over it, like a seesaw. In order to gain my spiritual life up, I have to put my body down, And so you get those two extreme attitudes that I think you've captured very well, Rick. It all flows out of the dualism of their understanding in the day.
Do you agree with him?
I do.
Good. Well, we got that settled.
But what further strikes me here is the balance that Paul has throughout this chapter.
Yeah.
And in terms of the book, this is a long chapter, not as long as chapter 15, but still it's a long chapter, and he strikes a note of equality.
Yes.
It is not...
Yes. That's very unusual.
Yeah, right, in the literature in general, not just here.
Is the equality you're talking about the equality in a marriage involving a husband and a wife?
Yes.
Well, that's what I've heard, that the sort of the prevailing attitude was the wife belongs to the husband.
Yes.
He's the one who has all the rights. Whatever he expects, she has to fulfill. And it looks like this is not in harmony with that.
Yeah.
And
not
many
at all.
people have come to
right.
assume vastly different things about Christianity, largely influenced by it. And as you were talking, John, I was thinking of the difficulty that there would have been, because in a Semitic world, you have a different language.
That's right.
But here, we're dealing with the very language that gave rise to voice to Platonic ideas that now has to be used to reach, in some ways, the opposite conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is really interesting. It's really unique to find a speaker speaking in this voice here of genuine equality. The people who wrote the letter to him that he's responding to, that is already lopsided. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. They don't say it's well for a woman not to touch a man. Clearly, this is a male-oriented focus and perspective even within the Christian church. And Paul comes back in a very balanced, kind of inclusive way. It seems to me that Paul's valuing equally of the man and the woman derives, in fact, from his holism, the fact that spirit and body belong together. People tended in that time to identify the male with the spirit and the woman, the female, with body, and material, physical. But because Paul is Jewish, he is much more integrative.
Right.
And out of that, he has a much more integrative and egalitarian view of family relations, including marriage, men and women. Isn't it interesting?
I thought it was pretty equal here, how they touched
I do
on
too.
it.
That's right.
This,
Paul's answer to these people is very equal, but what the people are writing is not.
Okay.
They are saying, a man must keep himself pure. And so apparently we may have instances in the church now cropping up already. We do know that they came up later, of couples in Christianity, in Christ, moving into kind of brother-sister relationship, a sexless marriage in the name of holiness and spiritual living.
Yes.
And Paul says, no, that's not the way. That's not the way this should cut. Clearly, he has three criteria which must come together. First and foremost, it has to be mutual. You agree together if you're going to take a vacation from your sexuality. It has to be mutual, by common consent. It has to be for a spiritual purpose, and it has to be for a limited time. Those three have to be together. And then he's very explicit, back together again.
Now,
Well, it's interesting because that seems awfully explicit by our standards. I haven't heard a lot of sermons
I don't
preached
think
with
I
those
have
three
either.
points. In other words,
Well,
it's
every good
almost
sermon has 3 points, Rick.
I know that, but I think
A, B, and
those
C.
3 points.
I mean, I've heard things along the lines of sort of, shun fornication. We
Yeah,
get that.
yeah.
But we don't get the other side where it's almost like Paul is saying now, that's one message, but here he is talking very frankly about the value of sexuality and the importance and the appropriateness of it in another setting. So he doesn't seem to be embarrassed about this at all, It's like everybody understands this is a part
Well,
of
of
normal
course.
life.
That's right.
And so let me clarify this for you in case there's any misunderstanding.
And
No.
Christianity embraces part of the wholeness is the whole of life.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's
Now
right.
comes the question, how do we feel about his concessive attitude toward what he's just said in verse 6?
Verse 6,
Yes.
Where he, where he
I say
says,
this is as a concession,
Yeah, you
not
read
as a
that.
command. So, in other words, make up your own mind.
well, I think he goes on. It's like, I wish that all were as I myself am.
Mine says, I wish that all men were as I am.
Well, but I think in some ways that's a preface to the rest of the chapter,
Yeah,
where he seems to
okay.
be saying, look, there are some advantages to being single. There's some advantages to being married, and I'm gonna. He goes on to sort of
Whatever you
sort
choose
those out. Sort
is
those
what
out.
God has
What is
Sort
given
those
you.
out.
What's your
And
gift?
Sure.
to say, whichever life you are called to, or you find yourself most naturally following, each one has its integrity, and I don't think he's putting one above another. I think we'd say there's some advantages to one.
Okay, would you continue on, please, Barry?
Sure. Verses 8 and 9. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to be aflame with passion.
Keep going.
To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy.
Okay, stop right there. What does that verse mean? I read that over and over, a couple times anyway, about, if you're married, your husband doesn't believe as you do, don't leave him, because you sanctify him by living with him.
Paul does not want Christian conversion to become an occasion for breaking up of a household, an occasion for divorce.
And this
Either
is
way.
a major reversal on the Old Testament.
Is it?
Oh, yes. Because, like with Ezra and Nehemiah, when they were returning from captivity and they had wives who were not believers, they were forced to
Send them
divorce
back.
them, to separate,
Really?
because
Yeah.
they would make them unholy. And now, in the light of Christ and in Christianity, and perhaps Paul's larger view, there is the recognition that holiness is greater and it will sanctify rather than the converse.
It's interesting, isn't it? Here in this medical center, we sometimes ask in genomic studies, which trait, which gene is dominant, you know? By analogy, Paul is saying something different than Ezra and Nehemiah did. They were saying the unholy is dominant and trumps the holy. Paul is standing that on its head and saying, no, the holy purifies the unholy, either direction.
Now, but I need to know, what does that mean really? Okay,
It means
so
don't divorce.
The husband is a Christian. His wife is not. But don't leave her because you are sanctifying her.
You are a sanctifying influence in her life. And he goes on and says, who knows?
So when does the end come? At the end, where is she? At the end of time.
I'm not sure Paul is asking and answering that question.
I'm talking about going to heaven. Is that so hard to understand?
Well,
I'm not sure this text gives us a basis for
it's
answering
not looking
that
down
question,
there,
is it?
but
Yeah.
by remaining, there is the opportunity for the influence to woo the spouse who is not a believer.
I have a story. When
That's
you're
a
ready.
very good way to answer it.
My grandmother was an Adventist, and she was in her 20s, and she was working on a ranch in her father kept her on his ranch in Kansas because she was cooking for his ranch hands. She took a trip to Flagstaff, Arizona to meet a cousin and visit with a cousin, met a shy forest ranger, and realized this was her best chance to get away from home, and she eventually married him. He was not a church member. He became a church member at the age of 76.
Oh,
He took a stand.
what a sweet
And I was there. I was in
story.
college at the time. He
Not
said
a dry eye.
It was really something, you know. 76, he went forward in response to an evangelistic call, joined his family. And when they went to visit him before the baptism and everything, you know how they do to be sure he's ready. Do you understand what it what it means to belong to the church and so on? He says, yes, I've been watching it for 40 years.
Oh,
So I know.
There you go.
precious.
And I learned some things from other people who knew them as a couple and talked about how she would provide him whatever he wanted to eat, even though it wasn't something she ate. In other words, she was very supportive of him and accommodating. But over time, her Christian influence and the kind of life she lived modeled the ideals so beautifully that it became a natural thing for him. And he attended church for years before he actually took his stand. So, I mean, it seems to me that it illustrates, to my way of thinking
Yes,
anyway, what
definitely.
Paul is saying. Stay, you never know what's going to
You
happen.
never know.
Stay there, you may have an influence that leads to people.
That
What
is
a
the
beautiful
sanctified.
story.
That's a real good case in
Really
point,
nice.
Rick. Verse 16 is exactly that. Wife, how do you know? You don't know. For all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. I think you've just validated that point.
And I think they'll both be in heaven, Carolyn, in answer to your question.
I think they will.
And the point is that there is a much greater chance, if they stay together,
Of course.
if the believer is a sanctifying influence.
Yes.
And with this equality, if this equality is maintained, and if the unbeliever is respected, and the fact that he or she is an unbeliever is irrelevant to the treatment, then that's going to have a profound influence.
Okay, Rick, would you continue on verse 17?
All right. The life that the Lord has assigned is the heading in the version I have. However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was any of you at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but obeying the commandments of God is everything. Let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called.
Now, which is the rule? Our verse division says that let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned to which God called you. This is my rule. But if we put the verse division before this is my rule, then it would be what follows. And of course, there were no verse divisions in the original.
That's true.
Or word divisions.
That too.
Sometimes words were
That
strung
too.
together. Yeah. So, in other words, Bernard, you're asking at the end of our verse 17,
Yes.
should the word churches have a colon after it? You know, this is my rule in all the churches, colon, and then 18 and following fills that in. Or does it refer back up to what has just been said? I don't know, but I'm not sure there's a great clash between the thrust.
If it's the former, then the rule is that lead the life that God has assigned you.
Yep.
This is again here. It is. These are inclusive rules that he is making, not exclusive. Don't let your religion shut anybody out. Your spouse, your unbelieving spouse. You've been called to do something. Lead the life that God has assigned you. Or if the rule that follows is whatever you were when you became a Christian, that's the way you are. You don't have to change it if you're uncircumcised. Again, I hear an inclusive voice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it seems to me that this passage reinforces something you were saying earlier, and that is that that the old way of looking at things changes completely. See, where
Yes.
as you were pointing out, there was a time when those who wanted to be holy had to put away those from another ethnic group and so on. Ezra and Nehemiah back in there. And Paul says, don't do that now. Well, all we have to do is think back in the pre-Christian times when the difference between circumcision and uncircumcision was enormously significant.
big
And now
deal.
Paul is saying, don't worry about that. Stay in the situation where you
Yeah.
are. This community is inclusive.
And Paul may have more than a modicum of what he experienced mixed in here too. Because you remember, though he was apostle to the Gentile, where possible he went from synagogue to synagogue. And he found there the proselytes, who were those who were attracted to Judaism but stopped short of circumcision. So he's not going to put up that barrier for them joining the church.
They would have been prime candidates for Christian conversion, wouldn't they?
Yes, they were. And by the time he was thrown out of the synagogue, he already had a base of believers and then was able to build on that. So here, he doesn't lay that upon them.
But Rick, they would have been prime candidates, but this computes the other way in the next paragraph, verses 21 and following, which have to do with slavery. If you are a slave, don't think that being converted to Christ means you can demand your freedom either from slavery. Otherwise you would have had every slave in the empire immediately becoming a Christian, and you'd had a slave uprising. So Paul again says, no, remain in the condition in which you are. Stay with it.
Beginning with verse 20, go ahead and read that for us.
Let each of you remain in the condition in which you're called. Now, next paragraph, 21 and following. Were you a slave when you were called? Then don't be concerned about that or hung up on it. I'll say this quickly because we're ticking away here. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever.
Or the footnote.
Yeah, right. Yes, the footnote, yes, varies. But again, 22, for whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when he is called is a slave of Christ. Now we've relativized the categories of master and slave, haven't we?
Keep going.
You were bought with a price. Don't become slaves of human masters. In whatever condition you were called, brothers and sisters, just remain there with God.
Good.
Yeah. So the minutes are ticking out here now for our session, but clearly we have level-headed wisdom for a people who are struggling. They want to be in Christ. They want to celebrate the Lord. They love God and Jesus. Now, how does this play out in their lives? And Paul takes up instance by instance, some of which no longer apply to us in the same way today, but the principle still does. Remain as you were, only now live it differently. Live it higher than you did before.
And it's one thing to be a successful evangelist.
Yeah.
It's a whole nother world
Yeah.
to be this practical and to have a clear vision of what it means to Christ in a culture like this that is different to where Paul grew up, but he's meeting them where they are
Yep.
and allowing them to work out their salvation in practical terms and encouraging them not to become extreme in any area.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me how concerned Paul was with life within the community.
Yes.
The letters that Paul wrote, which formed the first part of the Old Testament, first part of the New Testament to find their way into writing, were all concerned with life within the community.
Yeah.
And I remember going to a scholarly meeting and sitting in on a session where the title was "The Curious Lack of a Command to Evangelize in Paul's Letters." He doesn't tell these people. He's not preoccupied with sharing the faith and increasing the numbers. It's rather, how do you get along together? Once you have accepted Christ, what does it mean now for your life together? That's Paul's major concern in
Good
every one of
point.
his letters.
Good point.
Yeah.
That's right. Very much. Okay, we've got about 36 seconds. I'm going to let you close up, Rick.
Okay, well, what's the relation between mission and community? I remember someone saying, I think the community is created by the mission. My suggestion is it's the community that creates the mission. And it's the bearing of a witness and the part of the way Christians live together that forms the most effective way of communicating Christ in this world.
Beautifully put. On that positive note, this is Carolyn Thompson saying join us again next time for Searching for Answers.